Hi, I'm Neil Taylor, Director of the Corporate Law Center at the University of Cincinnati College of Law, and usually your host here on the Corporate Law Lab. But in this episode, I sat down behind the mic as the guest, interviewed by none other than my boss, Dean Haider Ala Hamoudi. We had a wide-ranging and frank conversation about my twisting path from litigation to corporate law, my time managing teams and building startups, and the experiences that brought me back to academia. Along the way, we also took the chance to pick each other's brains on legal issues we both care a lot about. I hope you enjoy this special episode, and I'm happy that I get to go back to asking the questions going forward, but with a deeper appreciation for my guests.
Well, welcome to the podcast, everybody. Some great news for you today, which is that we have a super special guest in Neil Taylor, who is the head of the Corporate Law Center and is normally the host of the podcast. The bad news is that your interviewer, as a result, is going to be the dean, who is a raging egomaniac. But that is whatever it is. So, Neil, welcome to your podcast.
Thank you very much.
It's a real honor to have you on. I actually am very interested in hearing a lot about your background and what brought you here and all the work that you've been doing for us and the wonderful work you've been doing here. But before we get there, why don't you tell me a little bit about where you grew up and when you started first to really become interested in business and business law?
So I was born in West Lafayette or Lafayette, Indiana. My father was a student at Purdue. And his father and his father before him had worked for the railroad. So my father, much to the chagrin of the brakeman and engineer, went into railroad management. So we moved to Baltimore early in his career, and then I lived in all the garden spots of the Midwest. We lived in Pratt, Hanley, and Hansford, West Virginia, Ashland, Kentucky, Toledo, Ohio. It was every 3 to 4 years he would get promoted. I remember once he got promoted before we caught up with him. He went to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and we didn't actually get there before he got promoted again.
Punxsutawney Phil.
Yeah, Punxsutawney Phil. The movie obviously was not filmed there because none of it looked like Punxsutawney to me. Groundhog Day. And then I got off the train, as I like to say, in Cincinnati. I graduated from high school in Turpin, out in Anderson Township, and they then went to Pittsburgh from there, North Carolina. I was happy to just say, okay, this is where I'm going to be, and then went to Indiana undergrad.
Sure. So before we get to Indiana, you're sort of traveling around the Midwest. Your father is a railroad management person, so obviously a business executive of sorts. Did that help attract you into business and corporate work at all?
I don't think so. No, it was because he was very much an operations guy. I didn't really have much interest in what he did, frankly.
Okay.
I was much more interested as a child in what my grandfather did, who actually got to drive the train.
Right, sure.
And my other grandfather had a small factory that he had basically built by hand. So I always found my grandparents far more interesting than my own father's career. It was, it was never something I never thought I wanted to be a business manager. I was, I was the 6-year-old that said they were going to be a lawyer and nobody knew why.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's, I understand the feeling from my children who, Baba, what do you do? A fireman fights fires and a pilot flies planes. What do you do?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I get it. Great. Wonderful. So let's go forward now. You're at Indiana and your major was political science. What pulled you into political science? Was it a desire for law school or was it something else?
I think it was kind of a default major at first. Then I switched majors like 3 or 4 times. I started in poli-sci. I switched to journalism. And after a year of that, I said, I don't think I want to be talking about what other people are doing. I'd rather be doing something myself. And then I ended up with a poli-sci and finance double major.
Mm-hmm.
And before I completed the finance side of the major, I accidentally graduated with my poli-sci degree.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, that's one of those like fall into kind of things. I have a poli-sci degree not because I really wanted one, but because I ended up with one.
And did you enjoy your time at Indiana?
I had way too good a time at Indiana. I enjoyed it tremendously. Looking back on it, I wish I had taken advantage of more of the opportunities that IU had to offer. Back then we weren't a football school, which we apparently are now. They won the national championship the year before I got there and the year after I left, but we were always good. So Indiana basketball was the be all and end all, but it also had one of the world's greatest music schools, which we hardly noticed. We were too busy having fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I do remember someone recently came up with a statistic that Indiana hadn't beaten Ohio State in football since 1988 because they were good this year, and I remember a whole bunch of people in Columbus going, "Indiana beat us in 1988." Like that was the shock. Not that they hadn't beaten them in 37 years, but that actually 37 years ago they beat them.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, yeah, they were my senior year. They were 0-11.
Yeah,
so that was yeah.
Wow.
Lee Corso was the coach when I got there.
Oh, I do remember.
Just now retired.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So, but you said you had too good a time and you didn't take advantage of as much as you could have. But we were probably being modest because you were good enough to find yourself admitted into the University of Cincinnati College of Law, and you became a Bearcat. Yeah.
Not exactly the direct path you would expect there.
Okay.
In the summers. First, I worked at a farm in Newtown, and then my next door neighbor, his father-in-law owned a window and door company in Bond Hill, and I worked there in the summers. And when I graduated, I went to them and said, "Do you have any jobs?" And they said, "Sure, you can do inside sales." I did that for 2 years, and went to night school here at UC. Working on a management degree, mostly to rehabilitate my GPA and show that I was actually capable of getting a 3.8 or a 3.9 instead of whatever the final number was at Indiana. And then I did really well on the LSAT, and I called. They used to print in the back of the LSAT booklet. There isn't a booklet anymore. There was this formula, take your GPA, multiply it by X, take your LSAT score, multiply it by Y, and that number, this is where you'll fall on the band of law schools you might be able to get into. And I was above the number for UC, and I called Al Watson, who was at the time, I don't know what his title was, but he was the dean when he retired from here a few years ago. I called him up and I said, "Al, I'm X number of points above the line. Does that mean I'm likely to get in?" And he said, "What was your LSAT score?" And I told him, and "Wow, that's very good. Your GPA must not have been as good." I'm like, "Well, no, but well, we tend to look at applications like yours very closely." So my essays were all about my GPA here at UC that wasn't counting because only your first degree counts. Anyway, I got in.
Good. And that's,
Then made a point of going to class.
Well, you definitely did. I mean, and let me sort of, because I'm sure you're too modest to do it, recite some of your accolades. You were 4th in the class of 131, Order of the Coif. You were the Law Review's lead articles editor. You won the Helmer Prize, which is one of the major prizes that we have for the significant contribution of Law Review. The Dornett Prize, Morrill Prize, the Saylor Prize, and American Jurisprudence Awards in Con Law, Civ Pro, Corporations, and Criminal. So it's hard to imagine doing better in law school than you did.
Well, yeah, there were 3 others.
Well, okay.
No,
wow,
it's funny.
Talk
Actually,
about,
I was
talk about a perfectionist.
I was number 2 through most of the 3 years. I pumped the brakes at that point. I had federal tax. I hated it. So
and that dropped you precipitously
Yeah,
from
yeah.
second to fourth.
Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Well, but what's interesting to me is you obviously did remarkably well at Cincinnati, despite the slide on account of the federal income tax, and then you chose to go to Phoenix. And I'm curious as to what drove you to make that decision.
So Lewis and Roca interviewed on campus back. There was a partner, Brian Goodwin, whose parents lived here, and he would grab an associate every year and come do on-campus interviews,
Mhm.
and then spend a week with his parents. And so I signed up for the interviews because it was an interesting firm.
Mhm.
They had done the Miranda case.
Mhm.
That was kind of their big calling card. And the Brian brought with him as an associate Janet Napolitano,
Mhm.
who was at the time in her last year of being an associate, about to become a partner. Later, governor of Arizona, Department of
Attorney General? Oh, Homeland Security.
Homeland Security, president of the University of California,
Mhm.
and obviously very impressive. So I'm like, well, this is what the associates are like.
Mhm.
And back then, firms allowed splitting summers.
Okay.
So I spent the first half of the summer at Lewis and Roca in Phoenix, and the second half of the summer back here at Katz Teller. And my wife and I decided that we would rather raise a family out from under the watchful eye of our families.
Mhm.
And so when the offer came from Lewis and Roca, I went. At the time, I was like the fifth or sixth UC grad that was there.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't. It felt like a place where you could go, and like everyone else in my class was, Harvard, Yale, Michigan.
Mhm.
I think there was one guy from Pitt.
Okay.
Funnily enough, 5 years later, me and the guy from Pitt were the last two standing
Wow.
from the litigation side of the class.
Mhm. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, it shows the grit of the UC law grads like yourself. Now, you spent 6 years at Lewis and Roca, and what were you doing? It was mostly litigation, commercial litigation. Is that right?
All litigation.
Okay.
What I really wanted to do was appellate practice,
Okay.
and it was very hard to get into for kind of a weird reason, in that John Frank, who was kind of the dean of the Arizona bar and one of the original partners at Lewis and Roca, he was Hugo Black's law clerk in 1940. He knew all of the justices,
Mhm.
had signed pictures of all the current justices on his wall, which was an amazing trick given that he represented Anita Hill at those hearings and still got Clarence Thomas' signature.
Mhm.
But John he would only work with young women associates because that was his thing that he was, and more power to him. Um, Janet Napolitano was one of them. Mary
Mhm.
Schroeder, who later became chief judge of the Ninth Circuit, was, I think, the first woman partner at Lewis and Roca, and that
Mhm.
was all John's doing. Only way I could get into appellate was to convince someone else in the firm to give me a shot. And Janet was the one who did. And Janet eventually said to John, "Yeah, give the kid a chance.
Mhm.
He's pretty good." So I got to work with John quite a bit. But appellate practice was hard to build a whole practice out of.
Mhm.
So I was mostly doing complex commercial litigation and doing the appeals when I could get them.
Gotcha. Great. Great. No, I get it. And so you, thanks to Janet Napolitano and her intervention, you had an opportunity to do a lot of appellate work, but you did a lot of commercial litigation. And then you made the jump to in-house. And of course, that's where the big move into, let's just sort of say, your interest in corporate law really blossomed. I mean, you spent, how many years was it? 11 years? Do I have that
I
right?
think so.
Yeah, 11 years at Avnet in
Yep.
Belgium. Okay,
Yep.
so that's a remarkable jump because you're going. You're going. I mean, you're not only just leaving a law firm as an associate, but Avnet is a Belgian company. Right? And
No,
so,
it's based in Phoenix.
oh,
So
I didn't know that. Okay.
yeah, when I joined, they were based in Great Neck, New York.
Okay.
And they knew, though, that their CEO was going to be retiring, and the new CEO was coming in, and Phoenix was a compromise between the LA and New York contingents.
Mm-hmm.
And so they knew they were going to be moving the headquarters to Phoenix.
Okay.
They hired me saying, can you spend a year commuting to and from New York? We'll move there.
Mhm.
Which I say happily did. I did,
Mhm.
um, because I was kind of playing the long game. I remember in my interview, they asked me, "You're close to partnership. Why would you want to leave this?" And I remember saying, all the best trial lawyers I know have had their first heart attack and or divorce by age 45. And I'd rather, keep my health and my wife if that's possible,
Right.
and my family together. And so,
Which you have been successful in
which
doing.
I've successfully been able to do, where my wife has successfully done. She's
Mhm.
put up with me for almost 40 years now.
Heart attack free as well.
Heart attack free as
There
well.
we go.
So yeah, that worked out.
Good.
But they hired me to manage litigation.
Mhm.
And after I did that exclusively for 3 years, and got more and more involved in running internal investigations myself,
Mhm.
sometimes with outside counsel, sometimes just myself. And we had a big internal investigation that caught a lot of people. First time I ever went to Europe.
Mhm.
And the guy that was doing M&A ended up leaving the firm, as a result of all that. And we were doing, I think, 11 deals that year.
Mhm.
And they kind of looked at me and were like, well, somebody's got to do it.
Mhm.
So I went from not having ever done any M&A or any real corporate work to, a month later, I'm in Australia, being a finance guy, trying to close a deal by ourselves. There was between This was in 1999, I
Mhm.
think,
Okay.
right? So it wasn't like we had email back then,
Mhm.
but we barely had the internet.
Mhm.
We didn't have None of us had cell phones. So it would have been something would have had to gone terribly wrong for me to call back Phoenix and say, I'm stuck here. I don't know what to do. So
Mhm.
it was just kind of sink or swim. And, it's a little bit of a fake it until you make it. I remember on the last day of that deal, arguing one of the final points that I just, you know, spoke with more confidence than I had.
Mhm.
And somebody on the other side said, well, you're the expert. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Mhm.
But through that summer, that was the only deal I ran myself, but I was second chair on like 10 or 11 different deals
Right.
all over the world.
Mhm.
The real baptism by fire, but I learned a lot very quickly.
Yeah, no, I have to say, I mean, it really is impressive the extent to which you basically moved into corporate practice in-house, which is
Right.
unusual. And most people, it seems, I've seen. In fact, I began as a litigation associate, and within 9 months, it wasn't for me. Litigation, corporate work was much more for me. Um, so
I
at a
was
firm,
lucky
yeah,
in that the GC was similarly had been a litigator
okay,
and moved into had become corporate. He was hired by Avnet to do litigation, I think. Had become more corporate over time, so he saw that it could be done because
hmm,
he had done it. So it was never put to me like, well, you're just a litigator, but maybe you can do this. It was like, I did it. You
right. Did you find the adjustment difficult, just in terms of sort of the style, as opposed to being in a form of competition with one another? You're now in a form of negotiation. Really, the consent of the other side is necessary in order to get it done.
I think, yeah, I think where I struggled with the style was in long-term relationships,
Okay.
right? So at Avnet, we were an electronics distributor. We distributed, and they still do,
Mhm.
the semiconductors of every major semiconductor manufacturer. So we were, one of the biggest customers of Intel and Xilinx and Motorola and onsemi, and all of those relationships needed ending periodically. Not usually from the legal side, but when it did, it did. And that was where you had to adjust how you dealt with things. In the M&A context, it was a lot like litigation, right? Because it was a one-off,
Sure.
right? You're sitting across the table from me, you're selling your company, you're seeing how much money you can get out of me. I'm just trying to see how little risk I can take in this deal, how much I can get you to keep for the money.
So
And
you
I
see it as very zero sum, basically.
Yeah, I mean, zero sum, I mean, you don't wanna get a reputation as somebody that can't be trusted,
Sure.
but it wasn't yeah, so you didn't wanna get a dirty tricks reputation or anything like that,
No, no.
but you could be a very hard negotiator knowing that you were never gonna see these people
Mhm.
again.
But I mean, sort of the getting to yes of finding mutual advantage. M&A is much more of a look. There's just a price, and it's just a matter of finding the
Yeah,
right.
it's
Yeah.
it's a lot more of there's a lot of times we were in deals that we knew we were exclusive.
Mhm.
And this is also a difference between where you're in a deal where you have competition or you're in an exclusive where, we're buying from a founder entrepreneur and the only way we're even going to get into a room and
Mhm.
completely spin up all the lawyers and accountants to
Mhm.
buy this founder entrepreneur's company is if we know that we have an exclusive on the deal for a period of time.
Right.
And then, depending on whether or not the founder or entrepreneur is in the room or
Mhm.
not,
Right.
you can be as hard or as soft as you want.
Sure. Yeah. No, I get it. Get it. So, what kind of deals were you working on that you might think more in terms of the importance of preserving the?
So, periodically a supplier contract would expire or need to be updated because I remember one major company's deal was, had been inked in 1975 or something crazy like that, and this was 2001, 2002. It needed to be updated, and those were intense negotiations where it really mattered to the business a lot because, this is tens of millions of dollars are gonna be this contract
Mhm.
for a very long time, but you still have to so you have to do the best you can while preserving the relationship, and, I mean, I remember only once where, I was just pushing and pushing and pushing on a point, and the guy on the other side was just obviously dim, because I just kept pushing and he just kept, resisting, and I think at one point I said something like, "I'm not talking about anything that's beyond basic contract." And, you know, "I think we need to take a break now." And, I remember the senior vice president and I went out in the hallway. He said, "Has it occurred to you that he might get everything you're saying, but doesn't have authority to agree with you?" Like, "Oh, okay." And, at that point, I figured out, "Oh, well, we're not gonna finish today
Right.
because I need to get what I'm trying to get here." Um, it was like on how much of their warranty we could give to our customers. We didn't wanna make our own warranty on their parts. Um, so it was, I just had to accept that I was sent to get the deal done that day, and
Mhm.
that the only way to get the deal done was not to get it done that day.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that being a relationship. But the other thing about supply contracts, of course, is that it's very hard. It's much harder for it to be zero sum because there's a variety of different things you could.
Right.
So when you're thinking of an M&A, you're almost, and this is highly simplified, but you're buying an object. You're buying a company, and so the fundamental question, risk allocation, is a huge issue. But the fundamental question is how much you're going to pay for the target. Whereas with a supply contract, warranties, which you just mentioned, the length of the time, the price that you're paying, the way in which the schedule of payments work. They could go up or down or whatever over time. I mean, one can imagine any number of different things that, and so the the idea of doing your homework, understanding what it is that the other side really wants, where you can press, where you might need to give in, and finding some way to get to mutual advantage.
Yeah, and trying to not make as clear what really matters to you.
Mhm.
Because in a distribution business, we needed to turn our inventory as many times as we possibly could.
Mhm.
Working capital and cost of capital was huge for us because we weren't a high margin business. We
Mhm.
we made money by doing the same thing over and over and over and as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
So payment terms mattered more to us than practically anything.
Right.
If we could get 45-day terms from a major supplier, um, it was a heck of a lot better than getting 30-day terms. And to them, that probably didn't matter as much. I think they probably understood that that mattered a lot to us.
Mhm.
And they would hold back on it until they would give it, that would be their last give.
Gotcha. No, I get it. So, from Avnet, you moved to Millicom, and that was in Luxembourg. So I take it that Avnet, at some point, your work with them gravitated ultimately towards Belgium. Am I
Right.
right
So
about that?
what happened was I became deputy general counsel at some point.
Okay.
I After the first 3 years, I was put in charge of the North American legal department, and after 3 or 4 years of that, the deputy GC for Europe left, and they said, "Well, we need to replace him. Is it something you would consider?" And I said, "Let me have a chat at home." And to my surprise and delight, my wife said, "Yeah, perfect time."
Mhm.
You know, our kids, I think, were 9 and 11, 10 and 12
Mhm.
then. It was the point where, you know, they were old enough that, it wasn't like tearing them away from a babysitter or whatever,
Mhm.
and they were young enough that it wasn't tearing them away from a boyfriend or girlfriend.
Mhm.
Um, and, for us, that was a big part of it, was giving our kids that kind of experience, showing them a world outside of Phoenix. And we'd always traveled a lot with them, but always pretty much domestically.
Sure.
So all of a sudden, we're in Brussels, where you've got all of Europe is an hour away.
Mhm.
you know.
Absolutely. That's one of the nicest things about living in Europe. Or I lived in Hong Kong for a while, and it was the same thing.
Yeah.
Your weekend trip was not to Chicago, it was to Bangkok. That
Right.
was very special. So tell me about the move to Luxembourg. You moved and the move to Millicom. Was that you became general counsel? I know. Was that basically sort of for a general counsel position? Is that what you were looking for at the time? Okay.
Yeah. I had been by that time deputy GC for, gosh, 8 years.
Hmm.
Um, and I thought my boss was going to retire, but I also thought maybe he never would.
Hmm.
Um, and, it's one of those be careful what you say out loud, because at one point I said to him, "I think I want to get off the train now."
Hmm.
Back to my train metaphor.
Hmm.
And he's like, "Fine, get off. You're gone in 6 months
Hmm.
if you really want to leave. Otherwise, you can come back." I realized if I went back to Phoenix, it was going to be into a smaller job than when I left.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that people don't realize with expat assignments
Hmm.
is you can do everything possible to, pre-wire, hardwire your reentry,
Hmm.
um, but things are still going to change.
Hmm.
And so, it was clear to me that I didn't want to go back into less than what I was doing before.
Hmm.
Um, and I thought I was ready to be a GC. Why I thought I was ready to be a GC, but you
8
know,
years as a deputy. I mean, it
yeah.
makes sense. But tell me about the transition. How did you find, just in terms of leadership and the responsibilities, and well, and of course, once you're the person in charge, there are additional leadership sort of obligations. How'd you find that trend?
I felt like it had already happened,
Okay.
um, because my boss at Avnet had gone off to run a division while keeping his title.
Hmm.
I had been running that legal department for 3 or 4 years by the
Okay.
time. So earlier on, that transition happened to me. I always, when I look back at it, it doesn't scare me, how little I knew.
Hmm.
What scares me is how much I thought I knew
Hmm.
compared to how little I knew. I was almost completely unprepared and there was no formal anything within the law department of how to prepare people to manage teams. So when I first started managing a team, the only experience I'd had before that managing people was 15-year-olds picking tomatoes at Eichelt's Farm Market.
Mhm.
Slightly different managing a legal department, a contracts department, a security department, all the different things that came with it. So that was a little bit daunting, but I don't think I realized it until looking backwards how daunting it was.
Mhm. No, I mean, just the managing of people is something that I think many leaders, myself included, you underestimate how much your job really is managing first start. Because
Yeah.
you get promoted on the basis of your competence at whatever task it was, whether it's in and academics is particularly stark just because what you are good at has absolutely nothing to do with managing. But in any industry, you get promoted on the basis of having done well in your previous job, and yet the higher up you go, the less your previous job actually matters, and the more it is about managing people to do the work.
Yeah, and, it's you you realize that there isn't a you can read all the books you want,
Mhm.
and I think you should,
Yeah, yeah.
read all the leadership books you can, the Pat Lencioni ones are
Mhm.
nice and short, you can get through those in an hour if you
Right.
need to, and they're very good.
Or Kuzis and Posner, I always like
Yeah,
7 essential traits.
yep, and, but what you find is that whatever you find is the secret to managing people is only gonna work for a couple of months,
Mhm.
and only with the person that it's working with, and then if it's there's just no playbook. They're human beings,
Right.
right? And each one of them has different needs and different strengths and weaknesses, and you have to understand how to, like, work with them, instead of imposing your way on them, and that's not as easy to learn as it sounds.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And in fact, I like your advice of reading a lot of leadership because I think what you end up doing is instead of saying, well, the 7 essential practices of Kuzis Posner or Patrick Lencioni's How to Do a Team or whatever, by reading a variety of different material, you have the opportunity, or Jim Collins' Good to Great, one of my favorites, you have the opportunity to draw lessons from everything to sort of put into a broader inventory when you're trying to deal with people, as opposed to trying to use any one of these as a Bible, because none of them are a Bible. They're all helpful, but
Yeah, and I mean, the way I was picking them was by figuring out what the CEO was reading
mhm,
and then reading that,
mhm,
So I didn't, like, go to the library and say, "What are the 10 books on leadership I'd read?" But when you hear the, CEO start to parrot lines from Good to Great or Built to Last, you like, "Oh, yeah, I read that. I see
right,
what he's doing."
absolutely. Wow, Jim Collins and the Stockdale paradox, something that remained with me for a long time. Although I do have to plug our UC Law graduate who was a recent guest of the podcast, Gary Garfield,
Yeah.
and his wonderful book and his work on leadership, former CEO of Bridgestone America.
As I said to Gary, I've been in a lot of leadership seminars. I've led a fair amount of them.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do it on the day as well as he did it.
Mhm. Absolutely. That was a really, really wonderful seminar, and I'm glad our students had the opportunity. So tell me a little bit. I know you spent a little bit of time. Well, you spent 4 years actually in London with Helios after leaving Millicom. Right?
Yeah, so I sold the towers from Millicom to Helios,
Okay.
and they actually didn't have on their list of things they needed as an in-house counsel.
Okay.
Um, and I think they realized during the course of those 3 deals that I was sitting across the table not running my meter, from their lawyers that were costing them, whatever they were costing them. Um, and they started to rethink. So we started to talk about it, and in the meantime, the CEO that hired me, into Millicom left, which was fine because I got along very well with his replacement. And then the chairman of the board, who I had a great relationship, left, and in the meantime, I'm having these conversations. Um, I started talking with Helios about a year before I joined, and then we put out an RFP for the next deal we knew they were going to bid on, and had to just like stop the conversation for 8 months, and then picked it up again once the deal was almost closed. It was my first 3 months at Helios. I at first sat and only listened to conference calls and didn't participate because I had just been on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became clear the deal wasn't going to get closed unless I got.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was always um, a little bit strange, but we managed it, and everyone was open and transparent on both sides. Millicom was actually quite happy that they were entrusting their towers with somebody that they felt like at that point. Because tower deals, unlike other M&A type deals,
Mm-hmm.
it is a deal that leads to a long-term relationship because they're
Mm-hmm.
sailing.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right, so I'm buying your towers, but I'm only buying them because you're going to use them for the next 10, 20, 15, however long they last.
Uh-huh.
And the key to the business was leasing towers to other people,
I see.
so that you get operational
I
off of
see.
the
I
tower.
see. So it's not really an M&A. Well, it's an M&A, but it's one that involves a long-term relationship between the two parties.
Yeah, and interestingly, at that point in my career, when we would do deals, when I was at Helios, I would send outside counsel into the other room to
Mhm.
negotiate the asset purchase agreement,
Mhm.
and I would stay with the business and negotiate the master lease agreement.
Mhm.
I cared far more about the master lease agreement than there were 10 or 15 key points, but once you got past price,
Mhm.
it was what it was. Tower deals were also very interesting because everything is a moving target.
Mhm.
Because if you want me to pay you a ton of money for a tower, I'm happy to do that as long as you pay me back a ton of money for the
For the
lease.
lease, right?
So you could never tell. I remember when we did the first deal at Millicom, we sold the towers. I'm sure this is public. I'm sure it is. I know it's public. I helped write the 20F. We sold the towers for $30 million, 750 towers. And then 6 months later, American Tower bought towers in South Africa for like double or triple the price per tower. And our board was like, how did this happen?
Mhm.
How did they get 3 times as much for the tower? And I'm like, well, we own 30% of that company.
Mhm.
And we were not trying to monetize anything other than the lease rate.
Right.
So our company was now very competitive in the market. And the way we set the price was we didn't want to pay tax if we didn't have to on what we made off the deal. So we called the team in Ghana. Ghana
Mhm.
was where the first deal was, and said, how much CapEx do you want to spend in the next year?
Mhm.
And they said 30 million. Great, that's the price.
Mm. That's great. No, that's and it is funny how those numbers can be manipulable. Of course, it also makes the deal very complicated because all the agreements have to come together at once, in a sense. I mean, I remember doing project finance where it was like that because you're going to finance it to the bank. The banks are fundamentally going to, I mean, it's a very high leverage deal, so they're going to finance most of the cost. But then that depends on how much it costs to build the plant, which also depends on how much you can charge electricity, which depends on how long the rate is or how long the repayment schedule is. And so everything sort of has to come all together at once between the utility, the construction contract, the project finance, the loan agreements with.
Then add to that you're doing it in the DRC or
Mhm.
Tanzania,
Sure.
um, and the level of complexity with people worried about, well, what happens if the government comes and takes it? We were and we had lots of conversation about whether we should insure against that. The good thing about the tower business is that it would be hard. If I had a mine and the government wanted it, they send a truck and a bunch of guys with AK-47s to the entrance to the mine and say, right, this is ours now.
Right.
If I've got 1,500 towers spread all over the country and you say you want them, well, all right, you got a lot to do to take on 1,500 towers from
Right.
me. Plus, they wanted the networks to work.
Sure.
So no one was ever looking to push us aside that way. But there were many, many, many challenges dealing with emerging markets, trying to do deals there.
Imagine. Did you ever need government guarantees? Was that part of sovereign guarantee? That was never.
No, we would go and meet with the ministers and say, it was actually, those were not difficult conversations
Mhm.
because you were always coming to say, listen, I'm investing in your country. I'm going to, yes, the towers that I'm buying, I'm giving the money to the people that built them. But the way that this works is if I build another 500, 600,000 towers, we were building hundreds of towers in every country every year. And when you're coming in as a creator of jobs and you're building infrastructure that's going to stay there, it's a completely different conversation than, I'm coming with a bunch of equipment, take your leave.
Sure. No, I can see that. I. What about corruption? I mean, to what extent, the extent that you were investing in the country, was there a desire? Yes, it's true. You're bringing in cell phone service effectively, but was there a demand from government intermediaries for a little bit of?
No, and this was a big part of our training programs with our teams.
Mhm.
Um, we became known as the people who don't pay.
Okay.
And I remember having a difficult conversation it was somewhere in Niger, Burkina, that area. And, somebody who on day one had given me a government business card, on day two was giving me another business card entirely and really just wanted a Mercedes S500 out of the deal. And it just said, you are a poster card for me violating the FCPA.
Sure.
And, you know, my blue passport is not worth this deal. So, and we did a lot of training on that. There is low level stuff that you can spend forever trying to get rid of and you never will. I remember at one point, our biggest type of theft that we dealt with was administrative theft, meaning if I bought 500 gallons of diesel from you to put in my generator that is going to be running 8 hours a day because we don't have grid availability all day long, I may get 400 in the tank. And and we would come up with all kinds of schemes to make that work. And I remember once we stationed auditors randomly at different sites for when the trucks were coming to make sure that we got delivered exactly what it was, and the trucks would just drive right by, and then the site would go down, and we learned our lesson that way, and so we'd have to come up with new strategies for how to deal with that. Um, and some of what we did was we hired women almost exclusively to be the guards at the towers, because they cared a lot about keeping those jobs. They were the ones generally that were the heads of households, that were keeping everything working, um, and so they were the best guards we had, and we never had armed guards or that. It was just much more to have a guard at the site that made sure that whatever was supposed to be happening was happening and would stay there, you know?
Right. Sure. So I had one more question before we sort of move on to your opportunity, your time at Infinite Foods and COO. With respect to Africa, and that was the extent to which you ended up having to rely upon local law within individual jurisdictions. What extent did you do that? And, how easy was it to find in obviously a variety of different countries, but how easy was it to find local counsel to work with?
Yeah, you do it. You would rely on local law as little as you possibly could,
Of course, right?
right? But because you were dealing with real and/or personal property, depending on what the local law was, we would have these arguments about whether or not the towers were movable. And sometimes it would be important that the towers be movable, and sometimes it would be important that the towers be immovable. We could argue either side of that argument.
Huh.
Um, but yeah, local council, I had some just amazing, excellent local council, some not. And it varies country by country, but it also varies, as it does everywhere, lawyer by lawyer. But it was more profound in Africa, and a lot of what I found was that we were a big opportunity because we weren't a one-off. We were obviously going to be we were going to be using lawyers going forward. They very, very much wanted us to be happy. And as a result, we sometimes got the answer that we wanted
Mhm.
instead of the needed. I remember at one point I don't remember what deal it was, but I remember arguing with the person on the side. Well, our local council says this. Well, our local council says that. And somebody says, well, should we go out and get a third opinion? And I said, only if we want a third answer,
Right,
right? Because this person's not going to know what the desired answer is.
right.
He's not going to know where to start. That's an overstatement, but we would we would do local law to the extent we had to, uh, and and I would find young lawyers. What I often found was that the senior associates were the ones that I was looking.
Mhm.
Those are the people that I would build the relationship. So, like George Samula had,
I remember.
he was one of those, guys that I met, uh, as I think he was already in, but he was the type of person that you'd find as a senior associate in a law firm that, um, because when I first started doing business in South Africa, I found that the senior associates were much more on top of things than the partners. Um, and I think part of it was that many of them had had the opportunity to be educated in the US or in Europe for at least part of their education. And the lawyers who had grown up and worked in the isolation of apartheid, they were still doing party of the first part, party of the second part kind of contracts where you're like, oh goodness, what is this?
Mhm. No, it makes a lot of sense when you have the opportunity to, for example, get an LLM at the University of Cincinnati College.
Indeed.
Yeah, and I should say, I said, of course, and I know that a lot of students hear the podcast. So let me take a step back. The reason that, and Neil, please correct me if I've got it wrong. The reason that there is such a strong preference for New York law, English law, just as an example, is the predictability of it. When you have two large, global, sophisticated companies, what they don't want to rely upon is just to pick a country in Africa, the law of Niger, which they're unfamiliar with. They don't know how it would come out. Even if you were to try to move it to alternative dispute resolution, very few international arbitration experts would know it. Courts in the country might be particularly unpredictable because of just an unfamiliarity. With the subject matter in question and size in question. And so by going to New York law or UK law, the parties feel much more comfortable with the reliability and the predictability of the outcome of what they've written.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think, and you mentioned alternative dispute resolution, we very much would look for um, arbitration in, if we were doing a deal in French speaking Africa, it would be arbitration in Paris.
Mhm.
If it was in English speaking Africa, it would be arbitration in London.
Mhm.
I never did a deal in the Portuguese country, so I don't know if we would have been picking Lisbon, but that's how we did that. And then we would also, if we were doing a deal with the sovereign, which happened at Millicom, um, we would try to get ICSID, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes,
Mhm.
which is part of the World Bank, and actually had an ICSID arbitration between Millicom and the government of Senegal during my time there.
That's great. Yeah, no, and I have to say, I like the fact that they are in London and Paris as an expert on Islamic finance. It's good for me. It's good for Cincinnati Country Day, where my kids go to school. So, but one thing I will say, even Islamic finance transactions, interestingly enough, I mean, and the whole idea is to be Sharia compliant. The preference is still write the contract under New York law, and then you know exactly how it's going to play itself out. To the extent that you're looking for Sharia compliance, go get an opinion as a condition for closing from a Sharia expert who can say, yep, this is Sharia compliant. But don't rely on the jurisdiction of, say, Saudi Arabia or Qatar or something else, because you just don't know what that means.
Right. Yep.
Great. So now you make the move, and this I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about. You make the move in April of 2018, where you move from, you know, being a legal officer, and I realized that you had a little bit of work as a CEO elsewhere, but this is the major move, it seems to me, that you make, to go to Cape Town, and now you're a COO. So you're not, I mean, you're sort of outside of the law. I don't want to say entire. Hopefully, nobody's outside the law entirely, but your focus is much more on the business side of things than on the law side of things. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I was running the whole company except for finance and marketing.
Right.
Um, so I was, I mean, it was a small company,
Mhm.
and I was I guess, acting GC
Right.
as well. So yeah, to the extent that there was legal work to do, I did it.
Mhm.
But yeah, my focus, 95% of every day, was operations and sales, operations, supply chain.
Right. And Infinite Fuse is the largest
Was.
plant-based was the largest sorry, largest plant-based food distributor in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Do I have that right?
Uh, Probably because I think we were the only one of any scale when we got going.
Okay.
We managed to get the distribution rights for Beyond Meat, and then leverage that to get Oatly's attention and Just Egg their attention. We had Violife cheese. Um, And when we started the company, everyone laughed at us. It was me and someone I'd met along the line in my towers. The tower companies were all trying to go IPO in 2018. The IPO market dried up, and at the same time, I got a call saying, um, "I want you to be COO of a food distribution company in sub-Saharan Africa." And I'm like, what do I know about food? Which was, how to eat it. Um, but then I realized that it was a distribution business. Spent 11 years at that, and I more about distribution. Realized I, and it was actually a pretty good fit. Um, then, once I started still living in London, and then moved to Cape Town, January of 2020, about 2 months before the pandemic.
Okay. Wow. And I mean, one remarkable thing as you were just describing this is the extent to which skills, and I try to emphasize this to all young lawyers and law students as they're emerging, the extent to which you're developing these skills, they really are transferable across different disciplines, different areas of law.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, beyond. I was talking earlier about how little I knew about management. When I started managing people. By the time I got this opportunity, I felt quite prepared, and to be able to manage people of different skills, ability, and those levels of education. I mean, that was the big change going into this business. It's like one thing to manage a team of lawyers. It's another thing to manage salespeople, operations people, supply chain team. There was there was a lot. The easiest person I had to manage was our IT person because it was. And
I
she's
would have
smart.
thought that's the hardest, but
Yeah, nah, she's smarter than me. So that it was very easy. Sometimes it's hard to manage people whose jobs you don't quite understand.
Mhm.
Um, I think I think the hardest person to manage is the person doing the job that you understand perfectly.
Right.
And I think the we could ask her, but I think the worst time I probably gave anybody was the person that I hired to run litigation at Avnet that I'd been doing myself for 4 years.
I was just going to say that I think it's probably easier, and certainly in my experience, uh, having served as a vice dean or as an associate dean under a dean who had been an associate dean. I learned a really important lesson, which is the conductor can't play the instrument because the instrument that you've played is the one that you know the best, and so you just have these judgments about how it should go out. But if you're doing that, then you're not doing. First of all, you're micromanaging them, so there's a morale problem. And second of all, you're not doing your job, which has nothing to do with being the associate dean anymore, or playing the instrument.
Yeah, but sometimes I completely agree with that, but there are times when it's so important that you just have to. I had this a very, very capable person running litigation, but if we got into something that I mean, we never had anything bet the company, but something that was really important and had board visibility, it almost it I don't know if it was the right thing to do or not, but it was what I felt like I had to do was to step in and go, right, I'm handling this. You handle everything else. I'm sorry that, I'm doing your job now, but it's just the way it is.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I've never had that quite happen to me. Now, there are certain matters where they're important enough that they're likely to rise to my attention anyway. So, I mean, obviously, I have an excellent associate dean in Dean Bailey. A good associate dean would you would hope always bring those to your attention because I
Yeah,
think
it's just when you get that level of board visibility in a public company,
Mhm.
you know, you have to be aware of people's feelings, but you can't be like, "Oh, well, it's on your job description, so therefore you have to do it," even though, we may get the CEO fired in the process if this goes wrong,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think the most important thing from the point of view of many of our listeners who are law students and potentially young attorneys is um, your leader never likes being surprised. If there's something a leader really doesn't like more than anything, it's being surprised. And so, to the extent that you can avoid that, sometimes it's unavoidable. I mean, things happen. But to the extent that you can help avoid surprises by making them aware of something that might rise to their attention, and then you could start to have, because you were talking about feelings, you could start to have a dialogue about the extent to which the leader does or does not need to be involved. But at the very least, if they're aware that something's up and then it comes to them, they're much more equipped to deal with it as opposed to getting a call from a legislator in the middle of the night, X, Y, or Z, where
Right.
that's a very unpleasant situation for.
Agreed, and you just have to develop a level of trust with your team that they're going to have that judgment to bring you the things you need to be aware of, and I used to have it happen all the time with, people that ran the contracts departments where they would have to escalate something to me because there were certain things that only I was allowed to give. There were certain things that I wasn't allowed, right? And they would escalate it to me because it had hit one of those stopping points. And I would always say, okay, if you're escalating on your side, make them escalate on their side. I'd get on the phone with the deputy general counsel of wherever. And, in 15 minutes, we'd have it done. And used to just frustrate the heck out of the contracts people because they would turn to me and say, you didn't say anything. I haven't been saying for weeks or months. And, it's just gone on and on and on. And you go in and say the exact same stuff I've been saying and you get the deal done. Why did this happen? And I just have to say, look, it's not the way the world should work. It just is the way the world does work.
Yeah.
And they're just things that, I have put strictures on you that you can't do certain things. And the other side has done the same thing. And the fact that both of you know how it's going to play out when it gets escalated, is, yeah, I get it. And maybe it's something we can fix going forward, but at the time you need to get it done, you just need to get it done.
And of course, there's always situations in which, uh, if you're trying to get someone's attention, you really need someone higher up to, in order to convey to the other side the seriousness,
Yeah.
to your organization. Someone relatively low in the organization. Again, it's not a question of the way it should work. It's just that they're not going to pay someone higher up rights because they're busy. And so the fact that they've taken time demonstrates to the other side, oh, this is.
Yeah, and when deputy GC, I mean, it's like you try not to get hung up on titles, but the other side notices.
Yes, they do. Yeah. So now I'm interested in the transition away from, and I realize, part of this is that Infinite Foods doesn't exist anymore. But at the same time, you did make a conscious transition not to stay either in sub-Saharan Africa or to stay in the corporate world, but actually to come back to your alma mater and to back to academia and back to what you described as your hometown in the sense of it's where you got off the train after many sojourns. And I'm interested in what brought you back.
A lot of things. So the Infinite story was, we were laughed at when we started the business. South Africans are never going to bake meat. Once we had grown the business hundreds of percents year on year to where we were now taking shelf space, the meat industry went to their friends in the government and said, make them stop using our words. So we were overnight not allowed to say that a Beyond Burger was a Beyond Burger. I think to this day they're now called Beyond Rounds in South Africa. But we were taken off shelf for 6 months. We ended up, this is where I went back to being GC full time because I then had to work with the rest of the plant-based, very small plant-based industry to fight the government on just ridiculous thing that they were doing because their friends in the industry wanted them to.
Mm-hmm.
And we eventually won that, but we were off shelf for 6 months. And so then it was just kind of a slowdown at that point.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, and I will say that that type of lobbying, some of our listeners might think that you associate it with a developing country. But in fact, in the United States, the meat and the dairy industries have been very powerful in working against plant-based industries as well. And in fact, milk is an example where the through lobbying, the idea was that milk would be confusing if it was not the product of the mammaries of a female animal. And the idea that someone hears almond milk and somehow is confused as to whether or not that comes from the mammaries of a female animal is, to my mind as a vegan, absolutely absurd. But it is a good example of the manner in which public choice theory, but the manner in which administrative agencies can very much be captured and regulatory capture by powerful industries.
Yeah, absolutely. But state capture was a massive problem in South Africa as well.
Yes, I just mean it's not exclusive to South Africa.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And yeah, and you see it happening here still on a state by state level, where some state will announce, oh, there was a big thing where they tried to stop tofurkey, which is a turkey substitute made out of tofu.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty obvious to me what it is
Mm-hmm.
with that name.
You would think,
but yet they've had to battle it, and it's definitely not a Africa only problem, but if you're running a small startup and you're off shelf for 6 months, you're done.
Yeah.
So at that point, I could see this coming. It's like, it was the last year and a half that I was there. It was kind of dying a slow death with the company, trying to get my team replaced in jobs that nobody's family was going to starve as a result of this happening. We tried to the bitter end to raise more money to be able to keep it going, but I knew what was happening. And I decided, gosh, probably 2 years before I got here, that I wanted to try to to get into academia. So it wasn't just, um, I always feel like with all the GCs we've had on, it sounds like just a series of seamless transitions where you fall from one thing into another. And I don't think we totally should be giving that impression. I'm certainly not going to grill my guests on the podcast and go, now, is that really what happened? Or, did something else? Um, but it was very intentional trying to get into an academic position. The job I got here was not the first one I applied to. It is very difficult as practicing lawyer for a long time, and I understand it completely. We have lawyers are different than most other disciplines in that everyone that graduates from here has the terminal degree. The last degree, it's not necessarily the last degree you're going to get, but it's the last degree you need if you want to teach. Whereas if you have an MBA, that's different than having a PhD in finance.
Correct.
So we all feel, speaking for the massive lawyers out there, we all feel like we could do this. We all know or should know better that those people like you that have been dedicated to this for many, many years have an advantage. So I started doing things to try and show that I could do this. I wrote an article, got it published at Hastings Business Law Journal. It wasn't Harvard, but I just wanted to show that I could do it, and it was, I but I felt like I was fishing without any bait on the hook. It took me a long time to get, and then when this position came up, I immediately called Professor Salamini and said, "This one. I have to be in the running for this one. This is like the job description in my CV. If you did one of those silly word match things that apparently the whole world uses, and I know you don't, to match resumes with job descriptions, it would have been an 87% match. Um, so, and I also knew and was happy that nobody at the University of Cincinnati was going to say, "Oh, you went to UC," because an awful lot of law professors go to Michigan, Harvard, Yale, Northwestern. There aren't as many of them come out of UC.
That's true, and that elitism is very unfortunate in academia. One thing I will say about a lot, and this is not you. In fact, I really enjoyed your Hastings Business Law Journal article, and I want to ask you about it in a second. But one thing that I would really say about many practitioners who want to come to academia, the way they frame it is something to the effect of, well, now I've practiced for 20 years or 25 years, and I'm now about 10 years from retirement, and I feel like it's time to give back. And I don't know that they quite understand how that's heard by those of us who've made it a career. It makes it sound as if what we're doing is spending our lives in semi-retirement. And of course, we take our profession of teaching to be very, very serious. And the mere fact that one is able to do deals, and many of us, spent some time doing that, doesn't mean that we can necessarily. The fact that one is able to do that doesn't mean that they're necessarily able to teach. And so some of that could just be, and again, this is not directed to you, it's sort of a more general comment as you were describing some of the uphill battle. Some of it is elitism, some of it is us needing to be more open-minded. And I think some of it is a matter of framing from the point of view of the candidate to make sure that they're delivering a message that they understand that what we do, we take what we do very, very seriously, both in terms of scholarship, teaching, and in service.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
no, I agree, and that was one of the reasons that I wrote the article, because I very much didn't want to be like, you guys have been doing this for your whole careers. I haven't, but I can do it just like you because I've decided now I'm going to retire and teach. I mean, think of any job that somebody says to me, I'm going to retire at the thing I actually do, and I'm going to do your job now because it's obviously so much easier than what I've been doing.
Right.
And so that was something that I was working very hard to show, that I wasn't looking for a retirement, semi-retirement. I I want to still work. I
Mhm.
enjoy working.
Mhm.
I probably enjoy it more than I should. Um, but um, but yeah, so I understood it completely. It didn't
Mhm.
make it any less frustrating,
Sure. No, of
right?
course, of course. That makes a lot of sense. So let's turn to that article before we turn to your time here at the Corporate Law Center. Uh, it, you're really trying to make it is a very good law review article, which is why it's published in an excellent journal like Hastings Business Law Journal, precisely because it seeks to really break a paradigm. You've got the historic argument is whether or not we should be focusing on a corporation should be focusing on shareholder value, sort of that I'm just going to the pure Milton Friedman, this idea that the goal of the company is to comply with the law, but
Make
then
money, period.
make money, period,
Yeah,
within legal bounds,
right.
right? I mean, no breaking the law or anything like that. I mean, there may be some ethical rules there too, but the point is you don't worry about the environment except to the extent that it's legally required to do that. You don't worry about the impact on a community or your workers or anything else. Your goal is to make money for your shareholders, and everything else sort of takes care of itself outside of that. To the extent that we care about the environment, that's the job of the government. It's not the job of the corporation. And of course, the stakeholder view is no, the corporation has to worry about a variety of different things in addition to the shareholders, its employees, its impact on the community. And of course, you find that historic debate a little bit tired and argue for a different model. So tell me about that.
So it actually, the article came from a couple of things. I had time on my hands during the pandemic.
Mhm.
And because I didn't have any libraries in Cape Town, and it was really hard to get books in, especially anything legal. I did have on my shelf the 2 volumes of the UC Law Review from when I was there, and I picked up an article that Professor Biancalana, who I was a research assistant for when I wasn't Professor Salamini's research assistant, who he had written for the third, I think, corporate law symposium,
Mhm.
and it was asking the wrong question. But he, I looked at, I reread the article, and then I decided to research. Well, has anybody picked up on this? That it's not the right question for whom are corporate managers fiduciaries, and no one had. The argument just went straight on. The business roundtable would go back and forth between shareholder value, stakeholder value, and I said, "There's no way for either one of you to enforce what you're trying to do. So perhaps we should look at it differently." And for me, what I saw had changed the most on the shareholder value discussion. When I was in law school, it was all about hostile takeovers and leverage buyouts. And you don't hear so much about that anymore. My theory was that people figured out if you make the managers rich through doing deals, they're not going to be as opposed to takeovers and mergers, and they're not.
Mhm.
Um, So I looked at it and said, neither one of you has any chance to enforce what it is you're trying to push. And it seems to me that the best interests of the corporation are to take care of the shareholders and other stakeholders. Um, there are places where the interests of the shareholders and the corporation diverge. And the one example I gave was share buyback.
Mhm.
I know that share buybacks are being pushed very hard by shareholders. I've been part of those conversations. Um, I I struggle to understand what the real value to the corporation as the independent legal person that it is. Um, and I just always found that there was a bit of kind of lazy argument that when a court referred to the corporation and its shareholders, that most academics that wrote about that said, "Oh, that's taking the shareholder view." Well, no, it said, "And its shareholders." It's only when the corporation is in play that shareholder value is the only value.
Sure. Absolutely.
And I just felt like somebody needs to do something different, or we're just going to keep having the same argument over and over. I remember
Mhm.
it was, I cited to Professor Lynn Stout um, her argument that, you could pick up this debate from 60 years ago and see that not very much has changed.
Right.
There's Stephen Bainbridge on one side and there's Lynn Stout on the other side, and they've both been saying the same thing their entire careers.
Yep.
And Bainbridge is still arguing with Lynn Stout 5 years after she died.
Mhm.
Oh.
Yes, I think that's very sound. Although I'm hesitant to jump too much onto only because I just published an article and book edited by some.
No, it's okay. It's okay I mean, this is one of the things that made me excited about joining academia is we should be having these debates.
Sure.
Right? We should be arguing back and
Right.
forth.
But
And
you're
I
looking
should
for
say-
a way to transcend.
Right. And
Yeah.
and I'm saying I don't disagree with everything Bainbridge says. I don't disagree with everything Stout says. I disagree with both of them
Mhm.
at times, and I agree with both of them.
Sure.
And I'm trying to find a third way.
Right. Yeah, and I definitely don't necessarily agree with. I mean, I think that makes a lot. Absolutely. Thank you for that. There was one other article I did want to ask you about before we came to the corporate, and it relates to the Corporate Law Symposium because it is the article that you and Professor Mank have written together on the Corporate Law Symposium. The piece I found most interesting was your description, and it's a very rich piece. I highly recommend it to our readers. Is it available on SSRN now or not yet?
I think we'll get it up in the next week or two.
Okay.
By the time this is out, we should get it up. Professor Mank and I have to. I think we've had that conversation. Anyway, we were just officially accepted yesterday
Oh,
into
congratulations.
the UC Law Review. So
Great.
I think this has got to be some kind of record. I had an article in volume 58. Now I'll have one in 94. I don't know if anybody else has got a 36-year gap between their two publications. But
I will be. I will. I think we should look that up. Somebody in the library should look that up. But the piece I found, I mean, so the piece is very rich. I really do highly recommend it. It's highly worth reading, and it goes all the way to, I mean, from the beginning to the very end, where there is a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. You're not going to get you'll get the cartoon, but the value of it won't be as much if you don't read the whole article. So read the whole article and then get to the cartoon. But the piece that I found particularly interesting is a former MIT boy, and thank you for pointing that out. Go Engineers, awesome football team.
It's not usually the first thing that's mentioned about MIT,
Well,
but
you
okay.
There's a few other things it's got going for it.
I don't know if you heard on the David Wilbrand episode, he went to Harvard undergrad. So I started with, so you went to the second best school in Cambridge, Mass?
I did hear that.
Yeah.
I did hear that. Yes. We were the year, we had all sorts of hacks that we did vis-a-vis Harvard. I mean, there was the weather balloon at the Harvard Yale game it's just MIT one. And then there was the hack on the Rose Bowl where it was MIT 34. And we were the year that I think they welded an MIT class ring to John Harvard statue in Harvard Square.
So when my daughter was there, she started there in 2012, and the hack that year was that they got into the Harvard Facebook of all their students and changed every picture to Mitt Romney.
Okay. This was I was before the Facebook time, but that would have been a good. In any event, one thing that you do point out, which I think a lot of us MIT folks would jump on, is the extent to which the court is both in its precedent setting itself up to do a lot of statistical analysis and a lot of math, and at the same time, in the actual case, did it very poorly. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. I mean, what is it that the court gets so wrong, and why it portends?
So let me see if I can do it in less than 40 pages. The court in Ohio versus EPA found that because 12 states had been exempted from a federal implementation plan, that may have changed the knee of the curve, which is EPA term that Gorsuch glommed onto that really means the law of diminishing returns.
Mhm.
and that there was somehow some change. And what they failed to recognize is that the only way EPA really did have a program that was so dependent on a particular mix of states, because of the way exponents work, the only way they could have fully dealt with the problem would be to have 8 million plans. And I did, call my daughter and say, I think this is millions of plans. And she did the math for me. So I probably should be citing her in the footnote where I did the math. But I just pretended I actually knew the answer. But I don't think that the court necessarily has anybody that knows that answer. And so, and this was a case that was done on the motions docket, but then they gave it oral argument. They set the question presented after it had been fully briefed on the application for emergency stay. And so then oral argument became, I guess it's always sort of important at the Supreme Court, although, sometimes you listen to the argument to find out who's winning. In this one, you could just see them all struggling with the math and trying very hard to avoid it while they were making a decision based on it. And the decision they made just doesn't really have any connection to what was happening below. It was kind of their reaction to something that seemed unfair.
And as you point out, it's relatively basic undergrad level sort of statistics.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I knew that it was millions of possibility without figuring out whether this was a pure factorial,
Right.
whatever Hannah said. It's the 2-bit 8, whatever it was. You would know if she said what she said to me, but I was just like, okay, how many is that? She said 8.233 million. Okay, got it. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, no, it would have to.
We all struggle. I think all lay people struggle with exponents. How fast something grows just doesn't make any sense. If you fold over a dollar bill 1,000 times, it'll go to the moon. Right? That can't. But exponents add up very, very quickly, a lot faster than we think they do.
Yeah, no. There's the famous, it's a famous Arab story where somebody did something for Harun al-Rashid, apocryphal, but and he asked him, so you're so wise, so, I'll give you anything you want. He said, well, just take out a chessboard, and on the first square, give me one piece of grain or one kernel of rice, and on the second, give me 2, and on the third, give me 4, until all, keep doubling it until the very end. It's like, that's it? You don't want like a palace or what? That's all I want. And not realizing, right, because you sit there and go, well, wait, 4, 8, 16, 32. What's 32 grains of rice? Not realizing by the time you get to 64, you are in the billions, right? If not the trillions, in terms of how much you're talking about. You're talking about the entire value of the Abbasid Empire, and nobody sort of internalizes that. It doesn't seem right. Absolutely.
But I think it's an important case because the lengths the court went to get where it seemed like it wanted to go. They have to pretend that they're applying standards that they're not.
Yeah.
And that's where the Calvin and Hobbes reference comes in.
Of course. Making up the Calvin Ball. So.
Right.
Absolutely. So, Neil, let's just sort of conclude by telling me a little bit about your time here at the Corporate Law Center. I'm interested in what it is that you are, for our viewers, hoping to get done, what you think you have gotten done, and what remaining ambitions you have, where the roadblocks are. Sort of a little expansive conversation about.
Oh, I'm done. This is all perfect. It's just gonna. Right. Yeah. That things not to say to your boss and when being recorded, right? I view it as 3 different areas, all of which overlap, and to the extent we can be in the center of that Venn diagram, perfect. I want the center to make an academic contribution. At one point, it was quite well known for its academic contributions. So I want to get back to that. I think that we've made a good start with the first symposium that I've been involved in. Well, the first in the 31 years. I was around for the third one.
Stunning success, I can certainly say.
But yeah, but we got to do it every year now and make it better and better and better. And it's not just the symposium. I really want to look for ways that we can react more quickly. It's one thing to put together a all day event that involves 6 to 8 to however much time you have to plan. You can plan and have papers presented and a mixture of academic practitioners, in-house counsel, all contributing. But I want to get to where we can do more kind of like quick hit things. The Delaware General Corporate Law gets. We should find a way to, in an hour or two, put something together so that both our students and practicing lawyers something useful out of what we get. So it's the academic side, the focus on the student experience more than anything else, both on academic and on practical. And so I'm trying, and then with the people actually practicing law.
Mhm.
So you take the academic, the students, the practitioners, and build bridges between all three of them. Keep building those bridges and building those bridges. I've gotten involved in the extern program because it's an awesome way for me to connect with the students when they're actually having those in-house or law firm experiences, helping them understand what to expect, what not to expect. So it's much more. I feel like in the long term that when I came out of law school, I was very well prepared to take the bar. I had and I had a lot of skills that I developed here, but not terribly many of them toward the actual practice of law. And I think that has changed. I'm certainly not the one coming in and saying, "Oh, great, we're going to do experiential learning now," because the law school has been doing that for quite some time. It was not a big part of the program when I was here.
Mhm.
And I think we have to keep growing that because I don't know how sustainable it is. And the next episodes you'll hear of Corporate Law Lab will be we're talking to law firm leaders about the business of the law. One of the things that I'm curious about is how sustainable is it for the law firms to continue to train the lawyers for everyone else? Or do we need to do more to put them out there, better trained and ready to do that work? Because if the clients don't want to pay for the first and second years, and the law firms have, that's always been pretty much, but the law firms have been happy to invest in the first and second. Are they still going to be, if they all pick up and go? I
Mhm.
don't know. Anyway, I want to explore it, but the more we can have people leave this school confident that they know more about the practice of law than I felt like I knew 35 years ago, then I think we'll have accomplished.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fundamental, which is why experiential learning is one of our 5 strategic priorities. It's interesting when you talk about the costs of the law firm sort of taking on the training. The interesting thing, of course, is that the, the untold story about focusing on experiential learning is that it is, generally speaking, more expensive to do experiential learning. Now you're doing, Neil, you're helping lead the externships, which is valuable and more cost effective. But if we think about clinical, which is the true intensive, uh, uh, experiential education experience par excellence. I mean, that's the sort of the opportunity.
Right.
It is more expensive, generally speaking, than doctrinal learning was, because you can have a doctrinal professor teach 80 students, and I mean, you're not doing justice to the professor or to the student or to anybody by having
You
any
can't have an
ratio.
80-person clinic.
You,
Right?
it just, I mean, 8 would be. I mean, it's literally almost a 10-to-1 kind of thing, and it is true. Again, maybe not the way the world should be, but the way the world is that clinical professors tend to make less money. They don't make 10% of what, and so there's always a cost that comes into experiential learning as well. So when you do invest in experiential learning, it doesn't necessarily look as much like you're investing in it as the doctrinal.
Yeah, we have a number of excellent clinics here between OIP, the ECDC, Sixth Circuit Clinic, Domestic Violence Clinic. I will now forget.
Legal Access Clinic.
Legal Access Clinic, thank you. But, even with all of those different clinics involved, they can still be quite competitive to get into.
Oh, absolutely. And they're very, very rich experiences. And that's where the externships are so valuable because they do provide very important experiential opportunities. And yes, they're not quite as intensive as clinics, but at the same time, they really do help prepare you for the practice of law in important ways. And of course, we have a variety of other programs that help provide experiential learning and really integrate it with the doctrinal work. In fact, our first year now, we're going to have a foundational skills class, which is going to be designed to do exactly that as well. So that trend towards experiential learning that you are helping lead in the corporate law space, Neil, is really broader across our College of Law and I surmise across legal education generally.
Well, and there's no place better than the University of Cincinnati, the founders of experiential learning, to make it go to the next level.
Home of the co-op. It's where Next lives here. And on that note of Next lives here, let me thank you, Neil, for the opportunity to host this podcast, the opportunity to interview you. This, I know, was a longer conversation than the normal podcast, but I thought it was a very rich one. And I hope people are able to take things away from it.
Now, I enjoyed it quite a lot. But I'm very much looking forward to getting back to being in the host chair where I get to ask the questions instead of answering them. But thank you very much for doing this.
No, a real pleasure. And signing off.